大家好. No, thank you so much. I'll do this in English. It's great to be here. I've never been to this part of the state, so I did a beautiful drive from Pittsburgh down the byway, down 7, which I recommend. So I'm going to talk to you about both of my books, actually. I have a third book coming out this fall, which I'll talk about at the end. But sort of just talk about my approach to researching China, how I approach China's history, how I sort of translate China for Western readers. There's a very famous Chinese writer named Lin Yutang in the 1930s who asked who will be China's interpreters. And he was a friend of Pearl Buck, and he went on to have an illustrious career as the inventor of the first Chinese typewriter and other things. But he had this long essay back in the 30s about how do we translate or interpret China for a Western audience. And now I've sort of folded back upon myself because my books are in China now. And in fact, this book is out this week on the mainland. It was out in Taiwan last year, and I went and did talks there. And now it's on the mainland this week. And so I can talk at the end, too, about censorship and some of the ways I walk that tightrope. I should start by noting that the Taiwanese version of this book is called Zai Manzhou, right? It's just in Manchuria. But on the mainland, as most of you know, I'm sure, Manchuria is sort of a gauche term. It's not used anymore. It fell out of favor after the Korean War. Now everybody just calls it Dongbei, right? And so the book on the mainland is called Dongbei Youji. It's just Journey to the Northeast instead, which is a bit confusing for readers because it sounds like a guidebook, but that's where we are. I will say, though, to start, that the only place I've seen the word Manchuria either inside Northeast China or even outside is on this road sign in London. It's a very, very posh street lined with olive green Land Rovers near Clapham Common on the south of the Thames. But you really don't see it that much anymore. Let me hope this works. Come on. OK. I'm going to go back for a minute here and just talk about how I got to China and my first book and the research I was doing and sort of what draws me to things. My first book was The Last Days of Old Beijing, Life in the Vanishing Backstreets of a City Transformed. I went to China not expecting to be writing about China. I was an undergraduate. I was an education major. I was teaching K through 12, the whole gamut. I was working as a journalist for the Wisconsin newspaper, as a daily journalist. I applied to the Peace Corps after doing a stint with United Farm Workers on the Texas-Mexico border. All I wanted to do was go and use my fluent Spanish in a Latin American country, right? And our government, in its infinite wisdom, called me and said, oh, you're fluent in Spanish, and you're a teacher. You should go to Turkmenistan. And I laughed and said, they don't speak Spanish there. And they came back with Kiribati, which I had to look up. Those are Pacific islands. Chad was one of them, Tunisia. We ended up on their 7th country. They called me and said, China, take it or leave it. And I said, I didn't know Peace Corps was in China. And they said, well, you'll be the first. There was a program that was set to start in the summer of '89. A bunch of Peace Corps volunteers had assembled in Washington, D.C., had gone through the training while the protests were going on nationwide. When the events of June 4th happened, there's great debate about this, actually. And I've actually gone back and interviewed officials on both sides of it. And I can't get a consensus whether the Chinese pulled the plug or the Americans pulled the plug out of protest, or the Chinese pulled it out of caution. But regardless, I went in '95. And I was in Sichuan. My first 2 years in China, I spoke Sichuanhua. I've never taken a classroom language lesson when I ended up there. And I used to write Chinese words on my arms, 我要啤酒. And I would walk around and talk like this. And so for 2 years, I learned how to speak Sichuanhua. When I moved to Beijing in 1997, I want to make sure I hit this button right. Good. I was living out here in Haidian by Tsinghua Daxue and Beida. And when I landed here, literally, like if I would answer the phone at the school where I was teaching, the person would say, 你是四川人吗? Because I had that like, 不晓得呀, 干什么呀, that 啥子嘛你呀? Everything was this very, very sort of rounded, fast, front of the mouth Chinese, right? Actually Sichuanese, which is, I think, a separate language. If not, we can call it a dialect. But it took years for me to get my Mandarin up to speed. And now when I speak Chinese, it's very Beijing. It's an R, how are, gummer. But I'll just bring us up to speed here before we get to Dongbei. I lived out here in Haidian. After 2 years in Sichuan, I was living in the far, far northwest corner of Beijing teaching. And even in '97, I grew up in Minnesota. I'm a hockey player. I rollerblade. I would skate in all the time down to Tiananmen Square, because back in the day, you could actually skate on Tiananmen Square. So it's hard to skate on it because it's stones, and there's big gaps between it. But it was a nice route to go if you know Beijing, because you're going around the lakes here, especially these lakes, right? But even in 97, when I was there, I would notice that these neighborhoods that I loved were being reduced to rubble. Beijing wasn't awarded the Olympics until 2001. I think it's a myth that Beijing transformed because of the Olympics. The transformation of Beijing was really going on in the early 90s onward, when Deng Xiaoping said, let's have a property market, right? It was really catching up to be a global capital, even in the 90s. But the Olympics certainly accelerated things. When I was teaching out here, though, and coming into the city all the time, I would see these neighborhoods being reduced to rubble. After I stopped teaching, I got a job as a journalist. I was working at Time magazine. And you can imagine, you get into the daily rhythm of the news cycle about how the West covers China. You know, I was doing a lot of things about currency, business, intellectual property, human rights, forced abortions, one-child policy, you know, what I call big ticket items, rather than smaller stories. And I felt, honestly, like a vampire. Not to say that journalists don't do an important job. I think they do, and they have a very hard time of what they do. I'm not going to sit up here and cast aspersions on journalists. But I really did feel like I was landing in front of somebody saying, what do you think about US-China relations? And the one would say, how? And it's, and I'd write it down. And I felt like a vampire, like I was sort of landing, putting my teeth in, getting the quote, and flying away. Instead of asking her, what questions do you have for me? You know, what do you want to know about the West? What do you want to know about China's changes that maybe I can see from my standpoint in a news bureau or in foreign ministry briefings or in economic reports and so forth? I didn't get to ask those questions, right? Because I had to write a certain kind of story often. And it really got me thinking after years of doing this, you know, like, what book about China do I want to read that doesn't exist? And I think that's when you know it's time to write a book, when the book you want to read doesn't exist. And so to fast forward a bit here, you know, I went to Tsinghua for a year. I learned how to read Chinese so I could use archives. If any of you don't know this program, if you're undergraduates or graduate students that are thinking of Chinese study, look up the Blakemore Foundation, B-L-A-K-E, Blakemore, M-O-R-E, Foundation. They paid me a stipend and my full tuition at Tsinghua out here to learn how to read Chinese, which was fantastic. And I went to the Urban Studies program and learned Beijing history. And it turns out, you know, the book that I wanted to read that didn't exist was, why was Beijing destroying itself? And frankly, was it a good thing or a bad thing? Because poverty may look picturesque, you know, if you're on the rickshaw tour or you're jogging through or looking at, you know, taking postcard pictures of things. But what was it like to actually live in these old neighborhoods, you know, in a Siheyuar, a Dazayuar, you know, a big dilapidated courtyard in the Hutong? Now, I mentioned the Olympics. You know, the Olympics were awarded in 2001. This map is from shortly thereafter. This is old Beijing. If you know, this is the old Ming Dynasty wall here. Now it's the Erhuan. It's the second ring road. These shaded areas are the actual protected areas of Beijing. Because I had been working at Time magazine, I could call somebody, you know, an official government source and get a quote like, what's going on in old Beijing? And the quote was always, we're protecting it. And say, what do you mean? Say, well, look at a map. You know, 25% of old Beijing is protected. That's more than old New York had protected. That's more than old Paris had protected. And in a way, they were right. But if you know Beijing, if you know these shaded areas, they may be protected, but you can't actually go in them. You can't live in them, right? I mean, Tiantan, this is Temple of Heaven. You pay a ticket to enter. This is the Forbidden City. No one lives there, of course. This is Zhongnanhai, you know, the leadership compound. And then you have some of these swaths of Hutong. But really, even in the early, you know, 90s and the 2000s, these Hutong, these old neighborhoods, were being chied. They're being destroyed from the edges working inward. And the policy officially was in the 90s, you know, start at the edges because the population is less there, and start chieing, you know, start destroying your way inward. All this is saying is, I'm going to get us up to 2005 here. I wanted to write a book about the Hutong, what was being lost. Was it a good thing or bad thing, frankly, that Beijing was modernizing this way? And I knew if I wanted to write this book, I had to quit journalism and just immerse myself and sort of become a Peace Corps volunteer all over again, only in Beijing. When we talk about old Beijing, by the way, this is about the same area as Manhattan Island. It's about 25 square miles. This right here is the Forbidden City, as I mentioned. This white space is Tiananmen Square, Chairman Mao's mausoleum. And then right here, there's this little melon slice. That's the front gate. I'll show you in a moment. And the neighborhood I'm going to talk about for the next 10 slides is here. It's Dashilar in Beijinghua. Dashilar, or Dajialan, the oldest hutong neighborhood in Beijing. Oh, gotta get that down. Okay, that little melon slice I just mentioned to you is the front gate. I'm showing you this because I'm writing this book for a Western audience. I need to know, editors always tell me, the best advice I ever got actually from an editor, LA Times editor, said, start in place. And she said, if you look at New Yorker stories, Atlantic stories, long-form journalism, they almost always start with a setting. The writer describes either somebody's talking, but you know where they're standing. It helps the reader orient him or herself as to where we're going and what journey we're about to take. So partly the reason I chose this neighborhood to live in, not only was it quite old and still standing, I like the idea of orienting the reader that we're going through the front gate. We're literally exiting modern Beijing and going back into old Beijing. I want to point out here too, this is a challenge about writing about China. What looks old often isn't old. And as you know, if you've studied Chinese history, you'll think about Wu Qiannian de Lishir. There's always that 5,000 years of history, right? You'll hear this quote over and over again. But one thing that fascinated me early on, especially in Beijing, is that history is like a palimpsest, right? It's a parchment that's been written over and erased and added to over time. Even if modern Chinese people in Beijing necessarily don't know this, our job as writers is to unearth this, right? This gate burned down. It was torched by the Boxers during the Boxer Rebellion, 1900, 1901. A German architect actually designed the rebuild, which is why you see these balustrades. This is not classic Qing Dynasty or Ming Dynasty architecture, right? But they've kept that sense, so it looks quite pretty. But even this is an amalgamation of Western and Eastern influences, old and new, put together at once. The myth is that when Beijing tore down its city wall, Zhou Enlai loved this gate so much, he said, don't tear it down. I've heard that story so many times in China. During the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guards were coming, but Zhou Enlai made a phone call. And I'll talk about that more in Manchuria, because I finally got to ask some museum people about that quote and what its origin might be and whether it's true or not. Now we're going out the front gate into another gate. This is Dajialan, a big fence or big wicker fence. I think the fences used to be out of wicker, not steel. But this is an interesting neighborhood because, again, it's different than, when you think of Beijing, Beijing's a magnet for the country, right? It's the cultural center, it's the educational center, it's the political center. In some ways, it's the financial center, even though there's Shanghai and Shenzhen. It kind of has always been that way, even in imperial times, right? And what I mean by this is that when the Manchu came down from the northeast, which I'll talk about in Manchuria, in the 17th century, they pretty much, unless you were a bannerman, unless you were Han Chinese that was employed guarding the palace, Han Chinese were told, get out of the imperial city, get out of that ring area around the palace, and they moved south of what was a moat outside the city wall there, outside that gate, and sort of created Chinatown inside Beijing itself. These streets in this neighborhood were all dominated by merchants, by Peking opera, Peking duck, tea houses, brothels, and so forth. It's a very interesting neighborhood. To deter thieves, the emperor said, we're going to put gates on either end of the hutong, these lanes, so you could lock them at night to keep people out. That's what gives the neighborhood its name. Again, I like all this as a writer because a Western audience can understand that. They get the idea of that, maybe more so than saying, Beijing's hutong are like Venice's canals. That's harder for an American who hasn't been to Venice, and it's not really an appropriate comparison to begin with. This is what it looks like from the top. I'm going to reorient ourselves here. This is Tiananmen Square, Chairman Mao's mausoleum. This is that front gate I just showed you, that melon slice. This neighborhood is Dajialan, Dashilar. This is about 1 square mile, the same size as Vatican City. Vatican City is 1 square mile and has about 700 people living in it. This 1 square mile has 57,000 people living in it. That's the official tally. Now, mind you, this is not multi-story architecture either. This is 57,000 people living in single-story architecture, all crammed in. Another reason I chose this neighborhood is this is Xianyukar, Fish Junction over here, Fresh Fish Junction. This has all been destroyed when I moved in 2005. It's still largely in ruins now. You can see this road was pushed through here. These courtyards were destroyed, and our neighborhood was next. And so I thought, great, I'm on the front lines here. Writing nonfiction is tough. You're only as good as your luck allows. If they had torn down the neighborhood while I was writing it, it would have been a very different book, a very different experience. One other thing I want to point out before we move on here is that when Marco Polo visited Beijing, if in fact he did, I think he did, in the 13th century, he said Beijing is as rigid as a chessboard. right? It's laid out at a perfect grid. And you know this if you've been to Beijing. People often don't say turn left, turn right. They say Wang Beizhou, Wang Nanzhou, right? You always know where you are in Beijing. It's great. It's hard to get lost because you're always on that compass. This neighborhood's not like that. Again, this was built by Han Chinese who had been evicted. It existed before then, but mostly it was free of the imperial planning codes. And so you see the way the hutong run here. These are old drainage ditches, that were filled in over time. You have 110 of these lanes in a square mile. It's one of the rare places in Beijing where you can get lost. Some of these hutong are as narrow as I am. Some of them are as short as from here to the window. It's a very interesting setting to write a book, starting with that before I get to the characters. This is the house. I found it online. How else do you find a house in Beijing? This is my bike right here. This is my roof that needs weeding. I'm showing you this too because I lived with an elderly woman and she really believed in this concept of jie di qi, like you're always touching the earth's energy. Very big deal for the elderly in this neighborhood to come out in the morning and they want their feet on the ground. You're touching wood, you're touching stone, you're touching mud, you have water, you're in touch with the earth's elements. They feel this gives them energy, right, and promotes longevity. One reason elderly people often don't want to move to high rises because they have that concept. This is not a beautiful courtyard, I should say. This is the doorway leading to the lane. When you enter that doorway, here's the street, you're coming off. It took me a long time to get into the Beijing archives. When I did, the Japanese, when they occupied Beijing, kept very good records. They kept very good tax records and very good censuses, if that's what sensei. I actually did find that this was a traditional medicine merchant. And he was from Shandong. He was a Waidiren, as Beijing loves the push-pull relationship between native and migrant. But he was a migrant who had come here in the 20s. He once owned this entire courtyard. In the 1950s, when the capital had been moved back from Nanjing to Beijing, the communist government was very poor. It was embroiled in a war with Korea. It didn't have a lot of economic support from the Soviet Union, or at least not enough of what it wanted at the time. It had an acute housing shortage in Beijing. And so at the same time, around 53, 54, the communist government said housing is a basic right. It's not a commodity. Your rent should be about the same price as a pack of cigarettes. So what you have is these beautiful old courtyard homes. You have an influx of government bureaucrats. You have an acute housing shortage, and you have no money. So the way the government solved that is to nationalize housing, essentially, in Beijing, not in the countryside, but in Beijing. And it divided these old courtyards up and put families into them. My little part is in the very back, dampest, coldest, wettest part. This isn't beautiful, right? And it's a reality about writing about this. I'm an advocate for neighborhoods, which I'll talk about, but I'm not an advocate for people living this way. So I do understand the government's push to change this sort of housing. There's 3 people living with the doors open here. I have 2 rooms. They all call me Da Diju. I'm big landlord because I have 2 rooms. There's 1 person living here. There's an elderly woman living here. There's 3 people living here. This is a propane stove. There's no heat. There's no air conditioning. There's no hot water. We have a cold water tap. There's no toilet, right? I do have broadband internet, though, which I think was interesting. Like, the Olympics were coming, and the government said, if you want internet, we'll install it. And they ran a line over my roof and down in here. Interesting, right? No lock on my door. No concept of privacy whatsoever, right? Very, very public life. Mentioned the toilet. The women's was right across from our front door. Mine was about 3 minutes away. I had this timed down to a T, as you can imagine. No dividers, so you walk, I had to go to a bathhouse to shower. I did this for 2+ years, by the way, almost 3 years. You use the public toilet. There's no dividers. It's a squat toilet. My students are all in there with me, my elementary school students, my neighbors, everybody's talking, smoking. It's like urban camping when you live in a hutong is what it is. It's not bad per se. I grew up in rural Minnesota, but I wouldn't want to do it full time. I never lost sight of the fact that I could leave at any time. I could bike across to the Grand Hyatt on Wong Fujing and use a beautiful bathroom. I would take a shower in the sink at the Grand Hyatt. I would sit and bathe myself. As the Olympics grew nearer, you started seeing advertising permeate everywhere in Beijing. Like back of taxis, you'd sit in the seat and there'd be a TV screen, blaring at you. It even reached our toilet. So you'd go in, you'd squat down, and you'd see this guy staring at you, and he's telling you all the symptoms you might be checking yourself for. And I got to find his agent and find out how he got this gig. But I'm showing you this not because he's funny, but also, one big change that was going on as the Olympics grew near was the rectification of English. So this hospital had to become the proctology hospital. They had to change their English name. And I'm showing you this because you know this if you research China. One of the beauties of researching China and talking with Chinese people in China is how frank the language is. It's not a toupee, it's Jaffa, it's fake hair, right? Call it what it is, always. And I like the anus and intestine disease thing too, because people often ask me like, well, is it hard being a journalist in China? Yes. Is it hard writing in China? No. If I told people I was a journalist, the shutters would go down. If I told people I was a historian, the eyes went wide open. 历史? 我们有很多. You know what I mean? Like, we have enough, we have so much history, you can have some, right? People were fascinated if I was saying I was researching the history, because often they didn't know it themselves. And when you show interest in somebody's culture, they reciprocate, right? So I was very lucky in the Hutong and on the farm that I'll talk about that I had a lot of helpers in this research. The police did not want me to live here. They said it was dangerous. No foreigner had ever registered to live in Dashilar. These were the people I was most afraid of. These were my bullies on my street. This girl, yeah, she's eating in every picture I have of her. I like that. But I do point this out, though. If I were a Communist Party official appointed to Beijing from Fujian, from Wenzhou, somewhere like that, if I'm not a Beijinger, right? If I didn't grow up in this neighborhood, you're not elected in Beijing, you know? The only way you advance in the party is if you show investment or development. You don't get points for protecting things, especially protecting what to your eyes is a slum. This is right across from Tiananmen Square, right across from the Great Hall of the People. I completely understand why a Beijing government official would say, tear it down, it's a slum. It's not a slum. It's a neighborhood of working class people, which I can talk about a great deal, but it's a big theme of this book and also the Manchuria book too. You know, it's handmade clothes, handmade toys, jerry-rigged, hot water heaters up top, overhead power lines, not a lot of open space, right? But these kids' parents come here and they work their butts off. And my biggest argument, and the way this book is taught now in China, is that the Hutong are good for creating more citizens. They're good for letting migrants come into the city, find affordable housing, get their kids into a school. They start paying taxes because they're earning money. They start speaking Beijing Hua. They really buy into it. I mean, it's a lot like, I think you know this probably. If you know migrants in America, they're often the most patriotic people, first generation, second generation. I find that with the Beijing Hutong as well, that the outsiders who were coming in felt so strongly about their neighborhood. Now again, though, if you're a communist official, you're going, you can't get a fire truck in here. You can't get an ambulance in here. Taxis can barely come in here. This is a fire hazard, on and on and on. And it's prime real estate. Why in the world would we let these people stay on this, right? So it's a very, very complicated question that I try to answer throughout this book. I told a Beijing official about what America had done, say Boston, New York, Chicago, with inner city housing and how it had been torn down and how projects were built or people were moved to the suburbs. And I said, you don't have to make the same mistakes that America did. And the official got very indignant and said, we have every right to make the same mistakes that America did, which I think is, cities go through these growing pains, and Beijing is no different. This is the view from my classroom. An interesting flip here, too. I thought I was writing this book about ancient architecture. To my students, I taught the same group of students, grade 4, grade 5, grade 6. They saw this as sort of an extension of their farm that they grew up in the countryside and then came to the city. Beijingers call the Hutong a sea of green. It doesn't look green when you're down on the ground. It looks gray and dirty, right? But when you're up and you see the trees and the foliage and so forth. My students, were 11 years old. They could tell me the names of all these trees. They knew that. They didn't know, if I pointed at the Great Hall of the People, they had no idea what that was. They're 11 years old, right? You can see the Western Hills out in the distance here. By the end of my first year, we had the Golden Arches come up here, and the students all knew that, of course. And then this landed after my first year living here. And that is, right, coming down to the edge of the Hutong. And no surprise, it's a Walmart, right? So again, I'm interested in this because as a journalist, I would have written American big box store comes and crushes ancient Chinese culture. But you see, this is a good year and a half after that store landed, and the market finds its way. The fresh fruit market, the clothing market, and so forth. And even Walmart itself, like the aunties all loved it. They would sit inside, it's air conditioned, it's heated. They wouldn't buy anything. Many of them were illiterate, and they wouldn't have to worry about reading prices because all the soaps were grouped together with pictures of soap, and stuff like that. The recycling people loved it because everything in Walmart comes in a package. So people adapted to this store in ways different than I think we do in our communities here on Main Street. That was a good lesson too, to tell the story through their eyes, not just mine, right? And then, I'll just wrap up with a few more pictures here. A hard thing about writing a book about China is you need a villain. In any good nonfiction book, you need an antagonist to keep the suspense going, to keep the reader turning the page. You could interview 100 different Chinese officials across a year, and you'd probably get the same quote out of them. It was very difficult. It's not like in America where Jane Jacobs was going up against Robert Moses in New York, where Haussmann was trying to reshape Paris and going up against his opposition, right? That in Beijing, there's sort of these faceless actors that are coming through and making these changes. And it really is, you'd wake up in the morning and this, chai, which means destroy, would be painted on your house. That was your marching orders. There was no real transparency about when your house might be torn down. Once that goes up, demolition was quite quick. You would negotiate a settlement. You used to get a fixed settlement. After they were awarded the Olympics, that changed. You could negotiate for a higher settlement. And in this book, I follow some people who go through the process. They get you out quickly. The trees stay because you can resell the trees, but the architecture has no value. And that house became this. And again, I look at this is Tiananmen Square right at the end of this road. I'm south. I'm looking north. And again, I look at this and you think like, okay, well, that looks familiar, right? And it turns out that the designer of this road did her graduate studies at UCLA. It looks sort of like an American boulevard, especially a Houston, LA boulevard. And she said, there's a more interesting story, though, than this road. She said, I tried to do a tunnel under the houses, too expensive. I tried to put some bends in the road, so people would want to keep walking and see what was up ahead. Can't do it, So she was more intelligent than someone who was just drinking a black crayon, and drawing lines on a city grid. I find this a lot with China, that as bad as it looks, if you see the plans, it probably could have been worse. That you have a city of almost 20 million people with a very, very archaic, chaotic planning bureau and overlap. And so it's amazing that any of it works at all, frankly. But for my purposes, I just want to show you that where this truck was is where these people used to work. This is Soldier Liu. He was a cook in the People's Liberation Army in Xinjiang. This is his mom and dad. I like that his mom is wearing his PLA apron, his camo apron. This book follows, like the farm book, which I'll talk about next, it follows characters over a few years as these changes are going on. I didn't want to be a vampire with them. I came to think of myself more like a toothless vampire. Like I would land and sort of, and then fly away, and then come back and see them 2 days later, a week later, a month later, and sort of watch the changes to their lives over time. Another character in this book is Mr. Wong. He's a recycler here from Henan, like a lot of recyclers are. And I watch him go from having a flatbed bike to having a used truck to having a new van, as he sort of climbed the trash ladder. And at night, I would go with him out to the Trash City, which is outside the 6th Ring Road now. And it's amazing. It's a city. You picture your athletics center here. Picture that time like 5. And one road is people who buy bottles. And one road is people who buy pillowcases. And one road is people who buy musical instruments and so forth. But the fun part of doing this book and these books, why I don't want to go back to journalism, is I have time to do this and get deeper and follow these people as they progress. This is little Liu. She's my star student of the book. Her dad is a security guard at Tiananmen Square at night. He laughs at this. He said, there's no piece of real estate on the planet that has more security cameras on it than Tiananmen Square, but he still has to walk it at night. And his daughter, she was my star English student. One of the things I like about them as characters, you're always sort of auditioning characters, who's going to tell your story, for Western readers especially, is unlike those other people I showed you, they're natives. He's Beijing born and raised and grew up in this house. He doesn't want to leave for a very different reason than the migrants don't want to leave. They want to stay there because it's cheap rent, they get their foothold in. He collects, he's a pigeon keeper. And if you've been to Beijing, this is a real big Beijing hobby. And he does war games with his pigeons in the afternoon where they send the pigeons out and then he tries to flag in his neighbor's pigeons. And then they go to get a beer and they do prisoner exchanges under the table where they give their pigeons back, and they gamble with each other and who can get the most pigeons and so forth. He just had a very, very different connection to this neighborhood than, say, I did or the migrants did. And a commonality through both of these books is people saying, I wish the government would come and talk to us. I wish a planner would come and talk to us. Just see how we use this neighborhood, right? See what's important to us, because you cannot have pigeons in these new developments, because pigeons are dirty. It was funny, whenever I'd interview him, I'd be sitting up here on the roof, And he'd be saying, pigeons are the smartest birds. Pigeons are the emperor's favorite pet. The first pigeon was kept, and his wife down below had their laundry out. Those pigeons shit on everything. I hate those pigeons. You know, she's going on, and he's in this very calm, like, pigeons are wonderful companions. Those damn pigeons. You know, she's going on and on and on. It was great. Yeah, different point of view. And the star of this book, I'll just show you like 4 more pictures of Beijing before we move on, but the star of this book is the widow, and she's a woman who was sort of the dean of, the principal, I should say, of our courtyard. And she had moved to Beijing during the Japanese occupation. She had had an arranged marriage to a KMT, a Kuomintang colonel. He left in 1948, and she was left behind in this courtyard, and she raised her children in a room not any bigger than here to the window, right? She always had the Beijing Opera Channel on her TV, so all day I heard, that was always going on in the background. She smoked flying horse cigarettes, you know, really awful cigarettes. They smell terrible, long ash always. And, you know, when I moved in, she said, listen, you know, Lawai, you're a foreigner. She said, we have one rule in this house. I said, what is it? She said, public is public, private is private. I said, okay. She said, say it. I said, public is public, private is... She said, say it! Right, public is public, private is private. The next day, not exactly, 4:30 in the morning, you know, she walks into my house. I have no lock on the door. I'm laying in bed. Get up, lazy bones! Lunch hole, lunch hole! And she's got the steaming bowl of dumplings, and she's got her cigarette going. And I remember laying on my platform bed, you know, this old piece of wood that someone had died on. That's how I got this apart. I'm already like miserable there. I'm hot. And I remember looking at her, and I said, Danyang, I called her, you know, a respectful name for a woman. Danyang, I thought public was public and private is private. And she said, in here, everything is public. And that was like, that was it for the next 2.5 years. You know, welcome to Beijing, right? You know, while this was all going on, you know, you can imagine around us in the neighborhood, you were getting these signs up about this sort of idea of what an American development or an American community would look like. But it doesn't look like an American community, right? Like, if you think about what we have here, if you just think about your 1-mile radius walk around here, a library, bike trails, common spaces to sit down. There's a social contract here about people use spaces. I can't just throw my cup on the ground, right? It's very, very different in China, as you know, and how these communities are planned. And the reason I'm showing you this is Soho, which is one of the big developers. Zhang Xin is the CEO. She's a Beijinger. She's Cambridge educated. You know, she went through, and I have to give her credit, she sat for an interview with me. You know, a lot of developers don't want to be public about what they're doing. And she was very, very helpful and open. I could not get her to come to my neighborhood, though. I couldn't get her to come meet my neighbors. I couldn't get her to come to the school, right? Instead, she would just show me her plans for this street. This is our main street. This is Qianmen our main drag here, which runs from that gate I started the Beijing slides with. And she said, you know, Meyer, listen, we're on Plan 36 here for this street, okay? It's not like in America. It's not like in England. I can't bribe somebody. I can't promise someone, you know, their daughter can come work for me. It doesn't matter because I'm not dealing with one person. I'm dealing with this ever-changing rotation of faceless officials who want to put their own stamp on things. She said, listen, I had a vice mayor, she said, who demanded that the lights be shaped like bird cages. And she said, I fought that over and over again. I finally gave in. She said, I had to trade him something. I said, what did you trade? She said, these. She said, name another development in Beijing that has benches. It's true. Beijing does not want public congregation. That's what leads to things like Tiananmen, right? There's parks that have it, of course. But a public space, you don't want people sleeping on benches. You don't want people congregating on benches and so forth. And so she said, it's always a give and take. You know, not even getting into zoning laws, not even getting into funding and so forth. So it sort of ended up, our neighborhood sort of looks like an Epcot Center, sort of Disney-fied version of the Hutong. But you know, this is what it's replacing. It's replacing this is Yanshouji, which if you know Beijing, this is off of Liulichang, the antique street in our neighborhood. This is a 600-year-old street. I had an urban planner walk this with me, and she said, everything you need on this street, except for open heart surgery, is within a 5-minute walk. And there actually is a clinic down here that they don't do open heart surgery. But it is true, when you look at this, like this is what people are attached to these neighborhoods for. And I give this talk in San Francisco is trying to renovate its alleys now around Soma. They want alleyway life, flower shops, cafes, and so forth. I've given a talk to city of San Francisco about how these alleys work. Amsterdam is interested in this concept. London is interested in this concept. You know, China invented this in many ways, and now it's being torn down. Maybe there'll be a loop back to it at some point. I'm going to transition now to Dongbei and to the countryside. And here's the impetus for this slide. These are my students, well, these are the kids at my school. I taught at Tan Er Hutong Xiaoshui. Tar Hutong Xiaoshui. I taught in the Hutong school, which is attached here. These are grade 4 kids. They're wearing the Tan Er Hutong, you see the TX, Tan Er Hutong Xiaoshui. They're wearing the school uniform, the Young Pioneer neck scarf, the Anchuan hats. You have to have the safety hat on, even though there's no cars in the Hutong. Rules are rules. They're grade 4. These girls are grade 6. Why aren't they wearing the kit? It's not because they're too cool. These kids, if you're children of migrants in a big city, your kid can go to elementary school. They can't go to middle school or high school. So there's an odd, and this is a big thing that's been going on, debated for the last 5-10 years about social benefits for migrant children in cities. But these kids are grade 4. They're going to stay in the elementary school. These girls are grade 6. They're getting ready to be shipped back to their home villages where their hukou is, their household registration. They're going to live with grandma and grandpa, with aunt and uncle, and take the middle school entrance exam and then go to middle school there. I started thinking again, like, what's the book I want to read that doesn't exist after doing this book? And the book was, where are these girls going back to? What is it like when you live in a capital of the world to go back to the countryside, and what's going on there? Now, I didn't follow them home. That would have been really weird. Like, Professor Meyer's here. So instead, I moved to where my wife grew up, to the far northeast. I traded that 57,000 people in 1 square mile for this, to a place that's literally named Huangdi. It's named Wasteland. Right? It's Bei Huangdi and Xiao Huangdi. To me, this is gorgeous. This looks like where I grew up in Minnesota. But to Chinese people, you can imagine this, they want to go to the cities instead, or most of them do. Interesting, the name Wasteland, you were asking me before the talk, why is it named Wasteland? It's very, very difficult to research rural history. If you go to the government office and you say, can I have the censuses? Can I have the tax records? They'll often say, oh, we burned them for fuel years ago. We don't keep records. It's very hard to find, local stories and stuff. It's all folklore. It's oral, passed down. It took me a good 2 years to sort of get a bead on why it has the name Wasteland. And someone finally explained to me, this village over here is named Mudtown, and this village over here is named Zhang Smelly Ditch, and this village over here is named the Dunes. Are you seeing a pattern here? And it was, maybe it's apocryphal, like Greenland and Iceland. They confused the invaders. But this area was actually settled originally during the Qing dynasty around 1740s. It's very, very fertile land. It's very, very nice land. It's very, very productive land. And the theory is that villagers gave these places these names so other people wouldn't settle there once they had been settled. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. To show you where we are here, I'm going from Beijing. I'm going about the distance from Washington, D.C., northeast into Maine. I'm going about 800 miles on a straight line this way. When we say Manchuria or Dongbei, we're talking about Heilongjiang today, Jilin, and Liaoning. And I'm going out here right outside of Jilin City on the Songhua River, which Russians used to occupy at some point. The Japanese were here for several years. I'll talk about that as well. I thought, okay, I did this already, right? I was in Beijing. I had a square mile, and I wrote about the people who lived in that square mile. I can do the same thing in the countryside. I'll take 1 square mile of village. I'll live here. I'll watch it change over time. So here's winter. Here's thaw, which is about right now, maybe late March, early April. They call this soil hei tu di, by the way. That rich, it's like coffee grounds. You think of wet coffee grounds? It's so fertile. It smells so good you can almost eat it, really. And here we are at planting. I didn't know this. A lot of people don't know this. They grow rice up here. It's not like southern China with the terraces. This is flat rice paddy cultivation, a lot like they do in California along the Stockton River. Very, very high-grade rice. It's the rice that's used for sushi. Again, going back, it wasn't the Han Chinese settlers or the Manchu natives who opened these fields. It was Koreans in the 1910s, 1920s, who were put here by the Japanese to settle the area. And they were the ones who actually opened a lot of these paddies up to cultivation. Although in this area, some of the Han Chinese migrants did as well. It's very, very high-grade rice. Here it is when it comes into ear. And then here we are at harvest time. It doesn't look like a wasteland. It reminds me a lot of Sonoma County and on, like I said, north of Stockton into Chico. You see these foothills in the distance. This is the last harvest they did by hand, actually, when I moved up here in 2010, because a bunch of changes I didn't expect were about to happen. I, again, found a house. I wanted to live like the locals. I wanted to sink in. Very difficult to find a house here. it's difficult to generalize about Chinese farmers or the Chinese rural economy because people who grow boutique crops like this village have a very high per capita income. They earn about a third more than your average Chinese farmer does. If you're a cotton grower in Xinjiang, a pineapple grower in Yunnan, a pig producer in central China, your economy, your life is very, very different. So when I'm talking about Chinese farming right now, I just want to point out, I'm talking about this village, this area, this economy, not China as a whole. It's very difficult to generalize about 700 million people, right? So this is the house I lived in. It was very hard to find one. It took a long time. It was mentioned, this is the village my wife grew up in. I thought this would be a piece of cake. I'll show up. I'm the son-in-law. My wife decided to quit her lawyer job in Manhattan. She moved there with me. We got there. She was there about a week and said, that's it, I'm out. And I went, what? She said, I have come too far in my life to live in this, right? That you made me move from Manhattan after all my law education and my job. I didn't make you do anything. You know how this is the joy of a relationship. It became that I made her do this. But you know, this was not the reason she wanted to leave. The reason she wanted to leave is that my wife is the fourth child in a family that was supposed to be enforcing the one-child policy and looked the other way for many years. And the village treated her as the baby of the entire village. She was the youngest person in that village for the first 6 years of her life. She comes back now as a Berkeley-educated lawyer. They still treat her like the baby of the village. And she said, after a week here, I've become a Chinese girl again. I said, well, I hate to break it to you. That's kind of what you are. You know? She said, no. This is very, very different. There's no context for what I do, what I've learned, where I've been. They expect me to wash your feet, give you a back rub, peel garlic, you know, that sort of thing. I said, I get it. You know, she said, would you like it if I moved back to your Minnesota hometown and started interviewing your family members about your childhood and talk to your teacher? I said, I get it. I wouldn't want that either. I haven't gone back to my Minnesota hometown since leaving when I was 18, right? So I get why she took off. In a weird way, this was the best thing that could have happened to me because the village felt very sorry for me then. And they said, you're just like us. One person leaves to go to the big city to make a living, and the other person stays back in the village to look after the house. And I was the only man doing this, mind you, but that's what ended up happening. So it was kind of a boon in a way. I found it was much harder to write about family than it was to write about strangers. I will say that, though. One quick thing about this house, you know, this is a Kong. This is a brick bed that it's like stepping onto a platform when you come home. There's a vent outside the house here that in the wintertime you stuff with dried corn cobs, dried rice chaff. You heat it, you know, you light it, it smolders. So when you're here in the wintertime, you're in a t-shirt, you're in shorts because you're so hot. And you start to smell like baking bread after a while, which is just awesome too. You sort of get that yeasty zest to you after a while. Again, I found I had to do something when I was in the village to get to know people, so I taught at the local school. Most Chinese people, if you say countryside, will say luoho, say it's backward. I'm showing you this to show you this is not a backward village, nor is it a backward school. It's a brand new school building, accordion gate, no handmade clothing here, like in the Hutong, right? These boys are out playing basketball. They kind of have this pounded down to like Wimbledon. It's so hard packed in the wintertime. Everybody always asks, where's the girls? Good question. I actually did get the census, and I counted as I was there. This village is also interesting in that there's almost a perfect divide between boys and girls. This is one of those villages that will not allow their kids to go into the fields. They're expected to go to school. Jilin has the highest literacy rate of all rural areas. It wasn't so odd being a foreigner in this village, oddly enough. Many, many people had gone on to Japan to study, to Korea. There were many North Koreans living illegally in this village that had crossed the border and were sort of an open secret. And you see that anyway in Dongbei quite a bit, you know. So it was an interesting place to be, again, as a writer, and didn't feel as jarring in some ways as being in Beijing did. Now, you know, I was talking about history. What do you do when you get up there? How do you find out history? I started asking people, like, what's something really interesting that's happened here? And everybody said, go talk to Mr. Meng. And I said, why? And they said, oh, Mr. Meng, he knows an alien. I said, okay. So I went out and found Mr. Meng, and I called him, and he said, oh, yeah, I'm the last house on the lane. And I said, all right, okay. And sure enough, I went up there, and he's on this old logging commune. And he, you know, about 6 years ago, when I had gone, he saw a flash of light here. He went to investigate. He was knocked unconscious. The next thing he knows, he was on his Kong, on his brick bed that night. He levitated above the Kong. He passed through the wall of his home. He was on a spaceship surrounded by aliens. I said, that's fascinating. Like, what happened? He said, oh, I made love to them. Oh, okay, Mr. Wong, that's great. Tell me more. So he ended up, his story kept getting deeper and deeper, that he ended up impregnating an alien, right? And I said, wait, did you tell your wife? And he said, of course not. But he told the media, which I thought was interesting. He made a phone call to the Harbin newspaper. This story went viral, as you can imagine. And people started coming to pay respects to him. Japanese tourists, Malaysian tourists. One guy brought him a cow. He couldn't use the cow. He ate the cow. But he became really known for this story, right, as China's first alien abductee. Now, he drew the alien for me, and it had concentric rings that got wider in the middle with two eyes, round eyes. The only billboard near this village was for Michelin tires. And I started doing, now to my wife, who's from Dongbei, said, this guy is the classic example of the Northeastern art of bullshitting. He grew up, like I did in Minnesota, and I'm like, how do you get off the farm? How do you get off, right? He invented this story, let's say, but he parlayed that into a job at a university in Harbin, the provincial capital, running the steam plant, taking care of the pipes. But he got his two kids into the schools attached to the university. So he got them off this farm to a university in a big city going to school. When I interviewed him many years later, he said when people say, aren't you that guy? He denies that now. Now he doesn't tell that story. It was like talking to a former adult film star, like, no, that wasn't me, really interesting guy. But beyond, so, when I was gathering stories up here, I thought, like, this is what this book is going to be, these nutty Northeasterners. But the first summer I was there, this is Hongqilu, Red Flag Road, the only road in the village, became this. It started being widened by hand, and then it became this sort of airport runway tarmac going through the village. And I realized rather quickly that, oh my gosh, I'm doing the Beijing book again. The changes that have been going on in Beijing about changes to the fabric of the village without village input, was replicated in Beijing and the Hutong was now going on in this village called Wasteland. And I just want to point out that the government didn't build this road. This road was built by the company that's advertising on these solar-powered lights it put in. This is a village cadre. She's Sai, if you've read the book. She's an auntie who remembers Japanese occupation, who can still count in Japanese, who can still sing the Manchukuo anthem in Japanese. But she's a diehard communist and a communist official. And she was livid about this change, that this town named Wasteland that had been a commune that had gone through all these changes in history was now being funded and sort of taken over by a private company. And I'll talk about that in a second. My first winter, this is what happened in my backyard. We started seeing the cranes going up. You see the traditional drying corn here. And then that became this. And so this, I happened to have found, by pure luck, a village that was being used as a test village for a national policy, which is farmers are old, food safety is a concern, we should mechanize our farming the way they do in America so we can get more harvest off of a shrinking amount of land. We should tell farmers, give up your plot of land, give up that rickety old house with the Kong that you sleep on, move into these new apartments. We'll give you a guaranteed payment every year for your land. We'll grow it for you. We'll tend it for you with a tractor, with mechanized harvesters, and so forth. And a company is going to do this now. And so that became what this book is about, this conflict between that clash of an old way of life and this new sort of inevitability. The difference was in Beijing, it's very forceful. That's not your house. Get out of the house. We want to build a mall there, whatever it's going to be. In the village, it was much more mediated and slow, because in a village, officially, the villagers own the land or they control the land, unlike in Beijing, right? This is another character in the book, Sanjo, who's the average age of a farmer in this village, 70 years old at this time. He was 67 there. And he said, I've lived through the Japanese, I've lived through the communes, I lived through the Great Leap Forward before that, I lived through the Cultural Revolution. If it wasn't an official telling me what to do with my land, now I have managers telling me what to do. Now we've gone down this capitalist road that quickly. And so he's a holdout in the book. He does not want to vacate his farm. Right as I was there, then President Hu Jintao came and visited. They used this rice. It's organic rice. The village tried an experiment long before other villages had tried this. It's very expensive. And this village's rice is served at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, right? So a lot of eyes were on this village, even when I was there. And the tallest structure that you can see until you get to the foothills Dazao Dongbei Di Yicun, manufacture the best village of the Northeast to the top village. It became this sort of experimental base. For those of you who can type Chinese, go on Baidu, type in Da Huang Di Cun, and you'll see a ton of coverage of this village over the years. I got very lucky that I happened to be here, that my wife had been from here. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to just go through this next part really, really quickly and then wrap up. The thing that interested me about this is that the Northeast has long been this place of experimentation and almost always failed experimentation. I mentioned earlier that China has 5,000 years of history. You hear that all the time. That's very hard to write about for a Western audience in 300 pages. The Northeast goes back, recorded history, to about the time of Romeo and Juliet, about the time of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. We're really dealing with 300 to 400 years of recorded history. Yes, there are Neolithic and Paleolithic ruins there, but it's much, much more recent. And because for many, many years, for millennia, this was seen as outside of China, outside the Great Wall, right? It was the land of the Manchu. This was one of the first emperors of the Manchu emperors of China who came south through the Great Wall. And it was this Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, that kind of gave China the border outlines that we know today, the shape of a chicken, as the Chinese will say, the head here. Taiwan's the egg, I guess. But this was China proper, and then the Qing added the Northeast, large swaths of Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet. I know there was play in the Ming and before that as well, even the Qin dynasty, but that's sort of that shape of the country we see is from that time. But when the Manchu came down to Beijing and used it as their capital, this was China proper, and Manchuria was sort of a separate realm to them. They had fluctuating policies over the centuries, whether Han Chinese could come there or not. Another interesting thing to me is, my wife's family didn't come to the Northeast until about 1910. So they're not there back 25, 30 generations with ancestral temples and so forth, right? It looks like a prairie. It looks like a new frontier, literally. Keep going. One of the interesting things about where I was, too, is you still had some native Manchu speakers. In this village alone, there was 8 elderly women that could still speak Manchu. I could not interview them without getting police permission. Because if you're a minority in China, you learn Han Chinese, you learn Mandarin at your school. Unless you're in Tibet or some parts of Xinjiang, you're learning Mandarin at school. What's your second language going to be always? English. It's not your native tongue. It won't be Korean. Maybe in Yanbian, that area, there's some Korean. But in this area, there was a teacher who was teaching Manchu to the students as a curricular, as a class. And he got a lot of pressure and a lot of time. And every time I came to this village to interview people here, the police would come. This was the most sensitive thing I've ever done in China, is trying to talk to an 86-year-old who spoke fluent Manchu. But that language is really dying out. And you saw at the school here, this passing on Manchu culture begins with me. And here it is in the Manchu script as well. And this interested me because I've done a lot of work with National Geographic, with Unesco, at how to preserve heritage sites, how to bring tourists in. UNESCO's big problem with Chinese UNESCO World Heritage Sites is that they're almost always Han Chinese culture. They're not as multi-ethnic as the culture itself. And you really saw that when I would start looking for artifacts of the Manchu homeland, I'll call it. The Willow Palisade, which was their version of the Great Wall, but it was an earthen berm with willow trees that marked boundaries where the Manchu could hunt and Han Chinese weren't allowed in. This is what remains of it. It's not marked and preserved the way the Great Wall is. My wife never knew this existed. The students in my classroom didn't know there was such a thing as the Willow Palisade. To them, the Manchu were the dynasty that let the foreigners come in, and the Opium Wars happened, and China became weak, right? There's not a lot of talk of the greatness of the Manchu on the official historical curriculum. There was one marker for this, but it was being toppled. Here we are, farmers gleefully showing me where the ruins of that marker were. Moving on, it was funny. I'm just going to show about 5 more slides, and I'll stop and take questions. But another thing that was odd about being up here is that you saw much more preservation of colonial sites than you did of native Manchu, Han Chinese, or even Korean sites. So this was the area that the Russians built their dogleg to the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladivostok. So you'd see an Orthodox cathedral that had been restored. You would see these old Russian train stations out in the middle of nowhere, still bright. The more desolate the surroundings, the brighter the stations always were, which I like, as if they were enticing you to get off. And you would see things like the Japanese-built hotels. This is from 1904. I'm standing in Dalian, which is a southern city, actually Lushun. That's the hotel, circa 1904. This is it 110 years later. And you could still see that archway there. The road is being built. And of course, 100 years later, the road is still being built because this is China. You still see the archway. But again, it interested me because there's no plaque outside this building. Beijing is, in a way, Beijing is sort of easy to write about because there's a lot of materials about Beijing in Chinese, in French, missionary diaries, marine diaries, and so forth. When you're in the Northeast, it's much harder to find this material. And in this hotel room right here is where Puyi was kept prisoner for 3 months as the Japanese got him out of Tianjin. This is the last emperor of China, the Qing dynasty, the Manchu emperor, was spirited out of Tianjin where he had been, put in that hotel and sort of forced or decided to become ruler of this puppet state called Manchukuo. But again, no plaque marks the spot there. That's not important history in China right now. But if you go to Changchun, which was the capital of the Japanese puppet state, you see this old temple. And I asked one of the vice mayors of Changchun, why do you still have this here? Why isn't this torn down? And he looked at me like I was really stupid. He said, people like to roller skate there. All right, there you go. All right, so it's much harder to find, unless you're talking to older people who remember the siege of Changchun or lived through Manchukuo itself. It's a lot harder to find official references. And I'm curious, this book came out on the mainland, and the Manchukuo chapters made it through. And I'm really surprised they weren't cut. Because the Northeast had a very different occupation than Shanghai and Nanjing did. I'm not saying it was a better occupation. It was just a different occupation. You do see these old war sites where there were germ warfare experiments and vivisection going on. This is the Unit 731 museum outside of Harbin. But you see scant preservation of this Millions to Manchuria campaign where Japanese farmers were moved to the Northeast. You see the flag here on the prairie, where they were going to have the same village names as their villages back in Japan, and they were going to create this new annex to Japan itself. And I'll wrap this up now. I'll just show you about 4 more slides and I'll take questions. But what interested me about this is how many Chinese historians, how many local historians were working to preserve this era of these million Japanese farmers. It wasn't actually a million, it's about 500,000, that were moved to the Northeast, were promised all this virgin soil, showed up and were handed a rifle and were basically told, you're going to be occupying land that was Han Chinese, Manchu, Korean. Now it's yours. And now you have to defend it, right? And they were really duped in some ways. And the reason I'm telling you this is, this is a river bend of the Songhua River in Fengzheng, which is outside of Harbin on the way to Jiamusi. And on these docks right here, there's a historian standing right there. This is where Japanese mothers and their children waited for the Japanese ships to come pick them up in August 14th, August 15th, 1945, where the Russians were coming over the border, the Soviets, and these farmers were left behind to rot. And the Japanese actually cabled their only alternative is suicide. That's basically it. And that's what happened on these docks here, where women lined up, they left their children on the pier, the women themselves stepped into the current and drowned. And you think, okay, why isn't there a plaque here? There's been movements by this local historian and other people to preserve this, and that Japanese were also victims of the war. Japanese civilians were as well. Now, we could debate this back and forth forever, but I will point out that in this area, there is, in fact, a large tomb that Zhou Enlai himself protected during the Cultural Revolution. This is actually a true one, where those Japanese children that had been raised or the mothers that had been found were buried. This had existed here. It survived the Cultural Revolution. This existed here until 2012, when a new monument, a new mass grave was found, a new monument went up. Now there's the internet. Images of this monument went viral. Chinese from the south of China came up by train and spray painted it, took hammers to it. The next day, it was razed with bulldozers. That cemetery is now closed. It's hard to get into it at all. So in the Northeast, I would often have this push-pull of people saying, well, we have a very different relationship with the war here because we were victims and so were some of the settlers that were here too. And a lot of times you go to these villages in the Northeast, you'll see street signs in Japanese. You won't see English language centers, you see Japanese language centers. This county estimates that about 1 out of every 5 people in the county has relatives or has been to Japan. They have a different sort of relationship with the war. And I always find that interesting in China when you try to get behind the official history to how history plays out on the ground itself. I'll just wrap this up now. I could go on forever about World War II. I didn't know this, that the general who surrendered Corregidor in the Philippines and the general who surrendered Singapore were both put up in the Northeast in a POW camp that was liberated. I didn't know that during the Korean War, for example, there were people in my village, 16-year-olds, were sent to the Yalu River. The Americans bombed this bridge, the Navy. They used their Corsairs. They were dive bombing. They couldn't cross into the Chinese side of the river. That was against the Joint Chief of Staff's, or what became the Joint Chief of Staff's diktat. They bombed this half of the bridge. Meanwhile, men in my village who were here were 16, 17 years old. They watched this fierce battle to bring this half of the bridge down. About 4 days later, the river froze, and they walked across the river and joined the war and turned the war to the stalemate we still have today. Right? You still see remnants of communism. These are people actually praying to a statue of Chairman Mao in Shenyang. They want to go back to that state-owned job. You watch this scene play out over, and they leave flowers, they're bowing, they're praying for work. Very different than in the rest of China. 3 more slides. In my village back in Wasteland, you still see some of the communist stuff, the propaganda. This is, long live the Communist Party. But it's faded on these old brick buildings, these storehouses. You still see agriculture learns from Dajai, which was the model commune of the 70s. But really now we're to where we are with my village, which is this new archway. Again, this is the second to last slide I'll show you. I was very lucky in that the man who ran the rice company was very open. He knows it's history. Come on in. I'll interview you. I'll talk to you. And right when I was looking for an ending to this book, essentially, he said, I have really good news. I said, what? He said, we're going to change the village name. I said, no, I love Wasteland. That's beautiful. I found out it goes back to 1740, and there's Mudtown, and John Smelly. I was going on and on. He said, no, look. We put our company name where the town plaque used to be. We're going to name the town Dongfu, Eastern Fortune, after our company. So literally, this village has become a company town, which is an amazing, that's what I said. Oh, 3 years of my life for that, I'll end on this slide, though, but it was quite moving, actually, because the people I was living with and the villagers when I was there, this was the last time they harvested by hand, I had mentioned, before they went to mechanized. And this is them drying their rice seed, as the sun sets. And it was very, very different than Beijing, in that in Beijing I found young people all wanted to get out of the hutong. They wanted a modern apartment. They wanted heat. They wanted to have a baby. They wanted to have a car. Old people wanted to stay. And in the countryside, it was the exact opposite. A lot of the old people wanted the comfort of a modern home. It was the young people who were saying, we can't find jobs in the city. We want to keep our ties to the land. Rice is at an all-time high. We want to keep growing the rice, right? And so it was this really weird flip in that, the house I lived in Beijing is still there. I thought that was going to be torn down years ago. The house I lived in Huangdi in Wasteland is gone. It's all rice paddy now, right? So it's this really weird flip that had happened. And I guess I'll just conclude this by saying that's the fun thing about research in China. You never know. The story usually goes in a different direction than you think it'll go. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Why don't you just call on people?
Yeah, if you have any questions about anything, go ahead.
Was that your article in the Times recently about this gentleman who was doing the Chinese language transformation?
No, but I saw that. The obituary, the Pinyin gentleman. Yeah. It's interesting. That's a sort of myth about that Chinese learn Pinyin before characters. Most people, in the village, my wife included, my son now, he does a Chinese school in Pittsburgh, start with characters, actually. I don't know if anybody in here did Pinyin before characters. Did you do Pinyin? Your grandmother or dad or mom didn't show you Ren or Wa? They didn't show you characters first? Together, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned of Robert Moses in New York City,
Yeah.
and now the Beijing going through all that urban land use changes. So, but back then Robert Moses or his kind of fellow urban planners at that time, they had 2 things. The one job is modernizing or more efficiency in urban land use. That's one thing. But
Right.
another thing was they really focused on was public access.
Yeah.
So they had a very progressive idea about these people's, common people, whether it's migrants or poor people's, their entitlement to urban space.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether China is like Beijing, that's modernization, that's urban planners will talk about it. So
Yeah.
modernize the infrastructure, that's good, but as long as they have a good understanding or the belief in the progressive idea of urban
Yeah.
space, there has to be public infrastructure. So
Yes, but it's a really good point because people love Robert Moses' playgrounds in New York. You know, there's still, they love Governor's Island. There's places in New York that Moses did that were actually quite lovely and stand the test of time. In China, it's so difficult because land is the only source of revenue right now. And so the idea of like donating very public, you know, Beijing has a height restriction anyway in the inner city. So that means you can't build towers taller than the Beijing Fangdian, the hotel. So you have this dense inner core that can't be built up. So that land is so precious inside the city. Like to advocate a park, a better bike lane or something, you know what I mean? It just doesn't enter into people's minds right now. I mean, the subways are very good, and some of the Beijing rapid transit bus is very good. There are good things that are going on too. I shouldn't paint too ugly of a picture. And again, many Beijingers want to move out to the suburbs anyway. But it just seems to be, I find when I talk to planners at Tsinghua or private developers or Speer, you know, Albert Speer's son, Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, has a big firm in Shanghai who does sort of eco-cities, and he did the Beijing accent and stuff. They all say the same thing of like, so Speer Jr. said when he first proposed the Beijing high-speed railroad station in the south, he proposed that as part of the Beijing Axis, right, for the Olympics. He said, we're going to have park space, we're going to have this and this, and we're going to end out here at a train station. And he said, all the city officials' eyes went down. And he said, oh, shoot, train station, that's old. He said, it's an airport for trains. And they all went back up again, right? And so there is such a fascination or push for the new, the better, that there's not a lot of pause saying, well, here's some things we do really well. Like in the Beijing book, I talked to a planner from America who worked for Bloomberg. And he said, you know, I tried to push, like, do not do cul-de-sacs. Whatever you do in your new developments, don't do cul-de-sacs. Hutong have no cul-de-sacs. That's the beauty of them. There's flow, exchange. Couldn't do it, you know? And so it's all those little things like that. Now, conversely, though, that man has gone back to do bike lanes in New York. And he said, maybe if I'm lucky, we'll get it all connected in about 25 years. Where in Beijing, I could just pick up a phone and say, we want a bike lane, and they'd put it all the way up to Tongzhou, right? And so there's that thing going on, too. So you're right, there are pros and cons to this. It's hard because my experience in the Hutong is very intimate, and I have those pictures. And people always say, well, there's some good things about Beijing's change too. And it's true, because it's awful to live in the Hutong the way it is. And until there's an amnesty where they say, if you want to buy rights to this house and fix it up yourself, it's going to stay awful. You know, in other places like Hanoi and Luang Prabang and other Asia capitals, NGOs are allowed to come in. There's matching grant. You know, in Hanoi, if you've been to Hanoi, like if you are in Luang Prabang for that matter, if you want to paint your old house, UNESCO will mix that shade of paint for you at their office so you can make your house look like it would have in a historic photograph. Beijing doesn't want outside agencies coming in and helping with this. It's a real estate market. Yeah. I once asked Cui Jian, the singer, why don't you sing about the Hutong and about chai? And he said, that's a real estate transaction. Like, that's nothing to do with me. You know, I'm from Dongbei. Like, what do you know? But I always thought that was odd, too. There's no, like, bard or poet of the lanes for their protection. Yeah, good question. Anything else? I was thorough? Yes, sir.
In a sense, you didn't answer your first question.
Which is what?
Was it better or was it worse? Or is it a mix?
I think overall, oh boy, how much time do you got? Yeah, you know, it's no, but it's really true. It's like you have to. So Sai, the auntie I showed you on the road, the communist cadre, she asked a question in the Manchuria book, which no one has ever asked me anyway, and I've been through planning at Tsinghua and officials and everything. She said to me one day, "How do you know when you've developed enough? When do you reach the tipping point where you go, okay, great, we got running water, we got a toilet, the school's great, the road's fine, stop, everybody stop, protect what we have." And I think you know, I've just been in town for the afternoon, like this city looks like it figured out when development's enough. Pittsburgh hasn't figured that out right now. We have a huge change going on in the city right now with development. So that's that balance. Yeah, and Beijing doesn't know when to say when. You know what I mean? Beijing gets bigger, 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 bigger. Yeah. Yes? The air pollution's awful, but I should also say it was always awful. It was awful in the 90s too. There wasn't a halcyon day of, you know, because before Beijing had 5 million cars, it had 80,000 MiND, you know, the little 4-cycle engines that were spewing out diesel fumes. So it's like, Beijing was always sort of lousy air. I mean, we have those beautiful blue sky autumn days, but It's always been lousy. It's like Madrid. It's a lousily situated city. You know, it's in that basin with that bad winds, and it was built to be a garrison town, not a metropolis. It's not. Another thing I always have a hard time, like if you picture London and New York, these are organically created ports that grew out of settlements that were on a riverside, right, or an ocean side. Chinese cities are built to be garrisons. They're built to be administrative centers that have sort of become trading posts over time. It's not the same thing. Yeah, Beijing has, 400,000 soldiers stationed in and around it. It's a garrison still. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Yeah, that public health announcement about
Yeah.
the proctology hospital. The character there that
Yeah.
I think you said was intended to be,
Yeah.
intended to be comic,
Yeah.
but he looked Western.
Yeah.
And yet you were the only Westerner using that men's room.
Yeah.
What's the purpose behind having a Western comical character?
Sure. Western's better, right? I mean, in the village, it wasn't that. It was Korean-style circumcision. All you saw everywhere you go, Korean-style this, Korean-style that, because that's modern and new, right? Yeah. Interesting, right? And I would say, oh, it's funny, because back in the States, we're paying people $1,000 to do the feng shui of our offices. Ah, you suckers! They do that. Like, never the twain shall meet, right? Good question. Yeah.
Oh, is that me?
Yeah.
All right. So what is the long-term plan for these
Villages?
former peasants who
Yeah.
are being resettled into modern apartments?
Really
Their
good question.
average age is 70.
Yeah.
I mean, I assume their guaranteed income is not going to last forever. And so is the end goal, if the U.S. is the model, is the end goal ultimately the final depopulation of the Chinese countryside?
I think so. The U.S. Census stopped counting farmers in 1992 here. They're statistically insignificant. Less than 2% of the American people farm for a living now. A family farm in America is about 1,000 acres to be minimally, operational, be it pork or corn or whatnot. I had a guy in Wisconsin tell me it should be like more 3,000 acres to really turn a profit. That's, I think, the end goal, definitely. It's hard now because you have this whole movement. You can find this online too, and there's people writing about this, Chinese people writing about this, about college graduates saying, I'm going back to the village. And what's happening, like with Huangdi, with that village, it's become part of Jilin City now. So you hear about this target of urbanization in China, and it makes it sound like everybody's leaving their villages and moving to big cities. No, what they're just doing is taking city metropolises and redrawing the borders so they got bigger. For this village, it's great because now it means city teachers are being appointed, they're being sent out to the village. So the kids have, quote unquote, city teachers now, but they are not of the land whatsoever. And it seems like a really strong policy goal to get them off the land, to let harvesters come in. Again, it's food safety is a big part of it. You see Cargill. You guys know what Cargill is? Sure. Privately held agribusiness based in Minnesota. They have sinister sounding, like Site 82 and stuff, where they're taking enormous sites, fencing them off with barbed wire so there'll be virus control, antibiotic control, and so forth, and taking over the farm production. Outside of wasteland, like if we just went like 10 miles this way towards the Changchun airport, there's a super farm site that's the size of metropolitan Los Angeles, 300 square miles. Singapore is the investor, as Singapore originally had done Suzhou very successfully and Chongqing now. Singapore wants to have this super farm where they can grow organic rice, organic soy, organic corn, organic raised pork. And that will be, there's an airport right there with Changchun Airport. Those can be shipped then to Singapore for their food supply, so they don't have to depend on Indonesia and Malaysia. I mean, you're seeing this stuff on a scale that's so big. And it is that the old farmers are dying off, but the younger people will go to white collar. But you're right. What's the plan? These guys are signing over their land rights for 3-year stints. So they're saying, oh, we'll give you 15,000 yuan for the year. But now they're saying, if we grow the rice ourselves, we can earn 18,000. It's a big difference. It's 20% more. So you have that push-pull. The contracts are just coming up now. I'll be interested to see. The problem is people move out already. They have their houses torn down. Now they can't go back.
If you think of Mao's revolution as being the countryside surrounds the cities, this is now the reverse, right? Of the city surrounding and infiltrating the countryside.
Yeah, and it's
Urbanized peasants.
people, it's here too. They're not, I know it's very, I don't want to say sexy, but it's easy as a journalist to write about bad things happening in the countryside. Where I was up here, in the book I have a guy, Sanjo, the old man I showed you. He went to Beijing and successfully petitioned and had a contract he signed actually honored by a local court. The Beijing petitioner's office said, hey, local court in Jilin, honor this contract. Like, they have such a different relationship with the government and their land than other parts of China. And again, it's because they have some education and some skin in the game, if I could say that. Do you know what I mean? Like, they have a good income, they're vested here. Whereas if you go to Sichuan in a really poor area with awful roads, they just have no communication. Earthquake happens, you're screwed, you know, for lack of a better word. So it's an interesting push-pull. But it's sort of a reminder to all of us, maybe to close on, like, when we say the word China, it sounds so monolithic, like everybody's marching lockstep together. China is so diverse. You know, a famous linguist said, if you say to somebody, do you speak Chinese? That's like saying, do you speak romance? Because even the country itself, the languages, the cuisine, the cultures, the economies, so different. So it's important to keep that in mind, I think. Yeah. All right, thanks, guys.